Thank you, Daniel. And Daniel didn't get his formal introduction, the president and founder of the Middle East Forum. And with this event, we wouldn't be able to do it without his inspiration, backing, and also all of his support over the last few months. And in addition, we'd also like to thank all of our speakers who have come here today, who will be presenting, all of our organizations who are co-sponsoring this event, and especially all of the staff, some that I'm looking at, some that I can speak of, and some that I can't speak of, that made today possible. So why Qatar? Why ask if it's a U.S. ally or frame it as a global menace? We will explore 5 or 6 different issues today through a series of panels, speeches, and conversations. Members of Congress, experts, former military officials, former intelligence officials, and analysts, some who have come from as far as Germany, the United Kingdom, Israel, and other places around the world to help us answer that question. The Qatari regime and members of its royal family have covertly and openly funded, hosted, and supported jihadi organizations for decades. It has supported in Iraq, Al-Qaeda, and later the Islamic State. In Syria, Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, Hamas. And in 2012, if we remember, Qatar pledged $250 million to Hamas, not to mention the $15 million payments which are now made to the organization on a monthly basis into the Gaza Strip. In Libya, it's focused on the Dawn organization, and Afghanistan, it permits the Taliban to maintain an interest office in Doha. Even if it might be used right now for a soft détente between America and the Taliban, it still was offering this years prior to any sort of negotiations that the President spoke about last night during the State of the Union. Qatar's support for international jihadist networks has long been a concern for Western policymakers and observers, as well as several other states. And especially in 2017, this observation became a policy decision, with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen denouncing Qatari funding of Islamist terror, cutting diplomatic ties, and implementing a partial blockade of the peninsular emirate. But its extension and support for jihadi groups does not just stop with violence. It also goes into the realm of non-violent Islamism. In contrast, Qatar's influence in the West is hardly discussed, despite the billions of dollars that Doha has poured into schools, universities, mosques, TV stations, sports clubs, PR firms, and of course, into the pockets of politicians. I'm thinking of such tactics like cyber hacking, the radicalization of Muslim communities in the West, and of course, the topic of our next panel, the 2022 World Cup tournament. The Middle East Forum has organized this conference not to just speak about pernicious sponsoring of violent activity in the Middle East, but also to examine these latter Qatari activities in depth. In addition to documenting them, the goal is to examine how varied Qatari tactics of exerting influence serve a much larger agenda. We at the Forum hope today's event will serve as a source of information and ideas for journalists, politicians, policymakers, and the public. What you hear today does not stop within these walls. They should be translated into policy ideas on how to stop Qatar's malicious and malign influence activities, both here in Washington, D.C., and also over the rest of the world for those watching on the live stream. Our goal is to correct the outdated idea that Saudi Arabia somehow remains the world's chief sponsor of Islamist extremism and jihad, showing that this role now belongs to Qatar. But it's not just about the global view of Qatar. It's also the information being more necessary because the Trump administration has been offered inconsistent views of the emirate. Early on, President Trump condemned the Qatari regime as, and I quote, a funder of terror at a very high level, and backed the 2017 Saudi-led blockade of Doha. In addition, he called on Qatar to shut down the Taliban's office in the capital. However, in April of 2018, the president contrarily praised Qatar as an ally in the fight against terrorism and referred to the emir as a great friend. There's a few developments which may help explain this reversal, including 1, Qatar's well-funded lobbying campaign. In 2017, Qatar spent $16 million on lobbying in D.C., by far almost the largest amount out of any other country, employing some 23 different lobbying firms. As part of its lobbying strategy, Qatar ordered a list drawn up of 250 influencers who were paid to travel to Qatar, including Alan Dershowitz, Mike Huckabee, Mort Klein, and other luminaries of not just those who consider themselves to be friends of the pro-Israel community in the United States, but those who were considered friends of the administration. The lobbyists that were working for Qatar were headed by such leading figures like John Ashcroft, Michael Mukasey, and David Rifkin, former Congressman Jim Moran, former Senator Trent Lott, and many former staffers and senators. Others included startup lobbyists like Nick Muzin and Joey Alaham, who may have been in the papers recently because of some litigation that has been filed against them. Unusually, many of the more recent contracts have included a clause forbidding the firms to work for other Gulf countries in any capacity, meaning that Qatar's strategy is to box out the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf Arab countries who may be on the other side of this regional dispute. A little more on their lobbying later. The second reason why the U.S. may have drifted between being pro and anti-Qatar is because of the U.S. military base in Al Udeid, which is the largest presence of the American Air Force in the region. It hosts over 10,000 American servicemen and serves as the main regional center for any missions against the Islamic State and other organizations that are threatening American interests in the region. And lastly, there may be an American continued distrust of Saudi Arabia, where U.S. policymakers, opinion makers, and academics continue to distrust the country and refer to it as the chief financier of terrorism and extremism around the world. The Khashoggi affair did nothing to improve the Saudis' reputation. However, while Saudi Arabia doubtlessly continues to work with Islamist movements, Qatar now leads Riyadh as the main financier of terrorism in the region, violent and non-violent, in the Middle East and in the West. Saudi Arabia has put itself on a path towards reform. It's indicated by the amount of mosques that it is no longer sponsoring in countries where it had formerly been the prime sponsor of extremism. Yes, they have work to do, but Qatar is getting a blank check, and they are able to do whatever they want without being held accountable. They must be held to account. Now, lastly, before we begin our next panel, this will be about 3 more minutes, and I'd ask the other speakers who will be on our FIFA panel to get ready to come up. I'd like to speak a little bit more about a personal foray into Qatar's cyber espionage strategy that affected both me and my employees of the organization, and also many friends. No, we weren't hacked by Qatar, but we did land on an information trove of over 1,500 individuals that were attempted to be hacked by Qatar, which included Bollywood stars, members of the Syrian opposition, members of the Syrian government, policymakers, a prominent American think tanker from the Center for American Progress, which you may find out in a newspaper story that will come out later today. But more importantly, there were those who weren't just targeted by the cyber espionage, but the individuals who may have had something to do with it here in the United States. In the world of technology, Qatar's leaders are two-faced. Speaking to the UN General Assembly in late September, Amir Tamim promised to host an international conference on the threats of cyber warfare and hacking. This after winning sympathy for cyber attacks against Qatari government targets. But that's only half the story. Former Al Jazeera journalist Mohammed Fahmy, who is with us today and will speak after lunch, has sarcastically written that Qatar is the perfect country to host such a confab. The regime's officials would give speeches about how they recruit hackers and select their targets. The cyber mercenaries on Qatar's payroll could discuss their career paths in hacking the citizens of foreign countries. And the American media consultants who work for Qatar could hold a panel discussion on how to successfully pitch and place hacked emails to and in the American media. This conference is a great idea. Qatar has much to teach the world about hacking and cyber warfare. After all, they're at the forefront of state-sponsored hacking of foreign nationals and other individuals. And last, I'd like to bring up a story that I've been personally involved with for the past year and a half, which was questioning the travel of American center-right, Zionist, and Jewish community officials on their treks to Doha. This is something that I referred to beforehand, and I said I would bring up. 2 organizations come to mind. One, the Zionist Organization of America, which has largely not been involved with this foray, but they were the recipient of a $100,000 donation from a Qatari lobbyist, unbeknownst to them according to their record, and it was returned after it became publicly available through a Foreign Agent Registration Act filing. The problem being here that there may have originally been a good faith effort to negotiate with Doha. There may have been a misled idea that these leaders who either received money from the Qataris or their interlocutors, or were on the receiving end of contracts between Qatari lobbyists and their attorneys. For instance, a contract that was signed between Alan Dershowitz, a prominent American leading liberal attorney, and Joey Alaham, his client, which only came out after there was much legal investigation into it. The original idea of going to Doha to broker peace, to think that they had this ability to somehow end Qatari support for Hamas, may have been noble. But Qatar's agents on Capitol Hill exploited their visits to Doha, and they exploited the funding of their organizations to torpedo a key piece of anti-terrorism legislation. Look it up now if you have your phone in front of you. HR 2712. The Palestinian International Terrorism Support Prevention Act, legislation designating Qatar as a state sponsor of Palestinian terrorism. These agents correctly figured that if leading American Zionists and other recipients of funding had good things to say about Qatar, or even may have not said anything, sometimes silence is a lot louder than words spoken, and they could argue in their over 150 contacts with senators and congressmen that such a bill was unfounded, indeed detrimental to peace, that key anti-terrorism legislation may not pass. And last session, it didn't, even though it received the support of both Democrats and Republicans and the majority of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Some of these individuals openly admit that they were duped by the Qataris, but they do not acknowledge the harm that they did. In our research that we've done at the forum over the past year and a half, including court documents, lobbying materials, 24 interviews, and conversations with the recipients of the funds themselves and those who traveled to Doha, discovered a myriad of inaccuracies in many of these visitors' stories, pointing to a longer, more intimate relationship with Qatar and its agents, including conversations between their PR agents, including continued friendships that take place in DC restaurants, and including visits that were going between their lobbyists and other individuals. We were able to track the story back from 2013, when Qatar initiated its Zionist influence campaign, to the current belligerency of the responsive individuals who visited Qatar on the Qatari dime, and after being outed in effect for accepting bribes from the regime. I'm not saying they're bribes, but they're akin to it. The story that we put together refutes most of the claims of these individuals, and it creates a direct correlation between those who visited Doha and the Qatari attempts to torpedo this legislation. We can only conclude that those who visited Qatar and their behavior afterwards confirmed anti-Semitic tropes about money grubbing immoral Jewish Americans. And as a Jewish American, I find it offensive. And two, these individuals refuse truthfully to admit their role in the failure of HR 2712, rendering them unsuited to continuing leading their organizations if they don't pen up. To redeem themselves and continue as respectable leaders of their respective movements, they need to come clean about their dealings with Qatar, and they need to make passage of this key anti-Palestinian terror legislation in their current organizational roles and in this current Congress, one that is at the forefront of their organizations. While some individuals who went to Qatar were invited to speak at this conference, they all declined. Their organizations, which were invited to co-sponsor this conference, also declined. The door is open, waiting for them to attend today. And if any one of you from any of the organizations that I mentioned or their leadership is in Washington, D.C. today, we invite you to this podium to denounce Doha. Thank you for listening to our opening remarks. And now we welcome our first panel.